everyone. Welcome to the next part of my top 5 games of 2017 list video, in which I discuss my third favorite game of the year. If you're new, I highly recommend you check out the first video on this topic, where I cover all my concerns and criteria which inform how this list is structured. The simplified summary that everyone uses when doing these kinds of videos is that this is all obviously subjective and your list will be different to mine because we all think differently and like different things. Of course, that goes without saying, but this wouldn't be a top 5 list if I didn't say it. All of what I say about a game is based solely on my experience with that game when I played it, and I obviously also cannot account for every update and patch and that sort of thing. I also haven't played every game from 2017. That's the gist of the disclaimer, but I'd still appreciate it if you gave the start of that first video a look before proceeding for a more comprehensive understanding of my approach. Anyway, my third favorite game of 2017 is... Wow, this game kinda just came out of nowhere for me. I'd heard of Nidhogg before, but had only seen a tiny bit of gameplay from the first game ages ago. The story of how I came across Nidhogg 2 goes as follows. My best friend and I had been talking about and playing a couple party games towards the end of last year, and then, one fateful day, I was at his house and he asked me, "Dude, I'm thinking of getting this game called Nidhogg. Have you perhaps heard of it?" And I was like, "Dude, of course I've heard of it. But, I don't know, it looked fine, I guess." And then he was like, "Well then, dude, this is not just Nidhogg, but it is instead Nidhogg 2. And then we proceeded to have one of the most enjoyable multiplayer evenings I've had in years. So, for those of you who don't know what Nidhogg or Nidhogg 2 is, they're essentially fighting games with an interesting twist and bizarre theme that have you fighting your way to either the left or right side of the screen, progressing through various stages of the arena until eventually you reach the Nidhogg, a massive worm creature that tells you you've won the match by eating you. That is your goal, to prove your strength and sacrifice yourself to this gross flying snake thing that's apparently based on a creature from Norse mythology. So the arena is separated into multiple stages, with both players starting in the middle stage. As I just touched on, one of you must fight to the left side of the arena and the other to the right side. You begin the match at a stalemate, each of you unable to move to the next stage until you first kill your opponent. Let's say you win the first fight. If that's the case, an arrow appears on the screen in your player color and direction that signals you are allowed to progress to your next stage in the arena. These colored squares tell you what stage you're in and who is the closest to the Nidhogg. Your opponent will respawn close to you and with a different weapon a few seconds after they're killed, usually in front of you, blocking your path to the next stage. So the only way that they can flip the arrow and thus gain permission to move to their side of the arena is by killing you. From here, you can either decide to battle it out and kill them again, or you can outmaneuver them and desperately continue bolting to your side of the arena. If you manage to get past them without killing them, they'll either attempt to chase you down, which will probably be unsuccessful and a waste of their time, or they can run off their side of the screen, which essentially counts as a death, so that they're able to respawn closer to you. The game ultimately becomes a frantic tug of war. When you don't have the arrow, you desperately want it, and the other person desperately wants to get away from you. There are tons of other little things you'll learn about as you play, mostly centered around reaction time and small decisions. You grow to understand how each of the 4 weapons behave in relation to one another and when to use them. When to jump, duck, roll, throw, and pick up weapons. How to jump kick, trip your opponent, deflect arrows, and disarm. When to stand and fight and when to make a break for it. When to change your weapon stance, when to jab and swing with your sword or dagger, and when to instead just let your opponent walk into it. The list goes on. And it may sound like a lot to take in, but once the controller is in your hands and you actually start playing, you should learn the game's language quite quickly, and all these things will just come naturally. If you do think it's too complex, you can turn off a bunch of things in the match settings, like the amount of weapons and such. One of the things that makes it so great is that you're not choosing from a bunch of characters and their specific movesets like in a lot of fighting games. You're not memorizing combos because everything you can do, the other player can do as well. So there's no such thing as an overpowered fighter. You could argue that maybe some of the weapons are overpowered, but personally, I think they're all really well balanced. Even the bow, which initially I had a bit of an issue with. I'm a huge fan of multiplayer games which aren't necessarily that competitive, but which do allow for a fairly high level of friendly banter, as well as quick strategic thinking and few straightforward but nuanced mechanics and systems. The kind of games which provide immediate gratification based on the skill associated with manipulating and reacting according to those systems, mechanics, and controls. Games with close quarters battles where everyone starts on an even playing field, where you're able to beat your opponent because of how much you understand the game and how its sandbox interacts with itself, instead of just because you had the better weapon and better stats. Now, I'm aware there are more appropriate games to compare Nidhogg to, like other fighting games, but I hope the comparison I'm about to make still helps illustrate my point a bit better. So I think this is why no other competitive multiplayer games have gripped me quite like Bungie's Halo franchise. I certainly enjoy the chaotic and twitchy gameplay of Call of Duty, as well as the grand-scale squad-based warfare of Battlefield, with their more extensive progression systems and other fancy gimmicks. What these games offer isn't necessarily bad, they're just different experiences to the one I'm describing. On the surface, these games seem more complex because they give you all this extra equipment and stuff to utilize and direct in battle. But in actuality, that extra stuff can nullify thoughtful engagements to an extent. When there are fewer mechanics, systems, and tools, there's more room for them to be better developed and nuanced, and to allow the player to partake in strategic gameplay on a much smaller scale at a greater frequency. In the case of Halo, there are definitely bigger and better guns, but an experienced player will have a good chance of winning a fight even with weapons one may consider inferior, because they know how to use them properly, and because they understand and have developed a feeling for all kinds of things in the game, like map control, when to cut reload animations, how many bullets to fire before a melee attack, how to strafe effectively, etc. So I guess what I'm saying is, while in many ways Nidhogg 2 is clearly a very different game to that shooting one with the green guy on the box, it still made me feel like I felt during the good old Halo days. Just an amazing sense of healthy competition. I find these games so much more intimate than a lot of multiplayer games. Not just because they can be played on the sofa with your closest friends and encourage some deranged behavior between all of you, but also because of this relationship you form with the game, the tools it gives you, and your opponent, whether you've put a face to them or not. I'm not saying that every action and reaction you make in Nidhogg 2 or Halo is entirely intentional. These are multiplayer games, and you can only do so much as a human being when it comes to predicting and reading your enemy and their equally thoughtful or thoughtless behavior. Nidhogg 2 in particular has some rather twitchy controls, and there will definitely be occasions where you've won or lost a battle for reasons neither of you understand because of things you didn't even realize you were accidentally doing just before you died. It can be a little frustrating when that happens, though it's just completely unavoidable, and it's usually fine because you're just too busy laughing. This game is hilarious, but I don't think it's really trying to do anything in specific to make you laugh. It's got great natural comedic timing on account of its sound design and manic, seemingly procedurally generated character animations. That's not to say you can't still feel like an absolute badass in this game, but usually that sensation is followed by hilarity from falling flat on your face because you walked off a ledge incorrectly or kicked needlessly a few too many times in a row. The art style of Nidhogg 2 is perhaps the most contentious thing about the game. I'm under the impression that a lot of people don't like it that much, and find it to be a big, ugly departure from Nidhogg 1. Personally, I think Nidhogg 2 looks like every pixel art game published by Devolver Digital got together in an 80s Las Vegas hotel room to make a baby, but just couldn't, and so left their mess there for mess-off games to sweep up into the sludge of what the f*** that is this aesthetic. And isn't that somehow just kind of beautiful? Don't get me wrong, I do think the game is kind of ugly. In spite of how expertly all of these sprites have been rendered, the subject matter is arguably a bit gross and tasteless at times, but the juvenile imagination of the whole thing definitely has an appeal to me. It may remind you of this sense of unrestricted and unrestrained creativity that has long since been forgotten. It's not aiming for any sort of thematic consistency, and so it can be very unpredictable and unique. Retro pixel art games are becoming rather tiresome for me at the moment. There's just so many of them now, and while Nidhogg 2 is technically still one of them, its thematic motifs are so insane that it manages to remain fresh and interesting, with great variety in its set dressing so that the levels never get boring or look too similar. I can feel the sense of liberation and freedom the artists must have felt when creating all this. So the art style and aesthetic is a bit hit or miss, but I think a more objective issue regarding the game's presentation would be that it can take a while to get used to the clutter. The bright, contrasting colors and shapes, along with conspicuous environmental animations, can be a lot to take in, even if the player characters are still somehow identifiable amidst all this. It also suffers from annoying performance issues. We tried playing it on a couple more than competent computers, and nearly all of them had had the game jumping into what initially felt like an intentional slow motion mode for a few seconds at a time. It turns out it's likely just some kind of frame rate issue. Nidhogg 2 has some catchy, unconventional electronic music, complementing the hallucinogenic nature of the game and its eccentric world. It assists in making these tournaments feel like rituals or ceremonies, in which its participants devour a crap ton of ecstasy before jumping in a two-person mosh pit with sacrificial weapons on a spiritual quest to the afterlife, while loud music engulfs their senses. I've found that the music helps contextualize the heinous visuals to an extent. Most of the songs are upbeat, but also make me feel a little bit uneasy, like how I feel when I think of the dingy nightclubs I see in the movies and which my friends have told me all about. I don't know, maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see, and everything here is just a bunch of random, thoughtless crap. But something tells me that isn't the case. What I am certain of is that I love Nidhogg 2, and I highly recommend this as a great local party game to try with a group of your friends. Honestly, that's all I've done and care to do or discuss with regards to Nidhogg 2. So if you're thinking of getting this game, I'd suggest you do more research and watch an actual review or two to get a proper overview of all its features and gain a better understanding as to whether or not it's a good value proposition for you. Although after many hours of play, Nidhogg 2 has lost some of its appeal. This game was my favorite multiplayer game of 2017, one which looks and can occasionally be chaotic, but which actually has the kind of gameplay depth that I find very exciting and satisfying. And that concludes the third video on my top 5 games of 2017. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd like to know what your third favorite game of the year is and why. I'd be even more interested to hear where Nidhogg 2 fits on your list if you've played it. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next part.